True crime. Of course, the subject matter has just encaptured us in both our television viewing, in novel reading, crime novels, even comic books have for decades enthralled readers. But maybe there's something more to it. Is there something we can learn by understanding crime and criminals more than maybe just how not to get caught? I remember, of course, in the 70s when there was the Scared Straight video series that was always important to show on television to steer kids in the right direction. But I think there might be even more to learn and grow. Well, my upcoming guest, Detective J. Warner Wallace, has made not one, but probably two careers dealing with crime and the way that you can approach these kinds of issues. And he's going to be my guest talking about his new book, The Truth and True Crime, on this. Come, let us reason together. Well, hi, everyone. This is Lenny Esposito. Welcome again to Come Let Us Reason Together. And I am proud to bring back on our show Detective J. Warner Wallace. Jim's been a good friend of the ministry. We've known each other probably 10 years now, I would think, something like that. And I love the stuff that you're doing. I'm really excited about this new book, Jim. Of course, you made your splash debut with Cold Case Christianity. God's Crime Scene came next, where you start talking about the evidence from the universe towards God. You've also written Forensic Faith, Person of Interest, and now The Truth and True Crime. I'm sure people can know a little bit about your background as being a cold case detective for many, many years through the Torrance Police Department. But why don't you tell me what motivated you to come up with an idea like this? This book's something a little bit different, I think. And maybe you can explain a little bit about kind of your impetus for not only this genre, but this book in particular.
Yeah, it's a kind of weird hybrid. I mean, this is the stuff I wanted to write about, Lenny, years ago. But, you know, I kind of dumbed into this adventure writing Christian apologetics books because I was serving in our local church as a volunteer youth pastor. My kids were in high school age, junior high and high school. I had both groups in our local church, and I was serving as their youth pastor. And I was just volunteering. I was still working full-time as a police detective. And I did that for maybe 6 years while those kids were in their junior high and high school years. And at the time, I was sharing with them the process that I used to become a Christian, just sorting through the evidence of the Gospels, using all those techniques that we use to assess eyewitnesses. So I'm doing that and not thinking much of it, not thinking I'm ever going to write a book. And when I went on a trip to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, an immersive experience, I took Sean McDowell in his group. He was a high school teacher at the time, and my daughter was interested in joining and attending this high school. So we joined this trip, and I'm teaching the students on the way up to Berkeley all the stuff that I've been teaching my youth group for years. Sean saw it, and Sean said, "Hey, you should write a book about this." And I thought, well, I don't really have time to write a book. And I told my wife, Sean thinks I should write a book about this, but I don't have time to write a book. And she's like, "Are you crazy? Why not why don't we just write an outline? Let's just see what happens." Well, that became Cold Case Christianity. Well, then what happens is, kind of like Lee Strobel, once you write one case 4 book, your publishers see you as a case 4 guy. And then you're suddenly writing the case for everything, the case for broccoli soup, whatever it is, you're writing a case for it. So I get that, and Lee was just so gracious to me. By the way, he wrote the foreword on the first book. So I journeyed down a number of books that were really just tracing my own steps toward becoming a Christian. No one in my personal life, you probably wouldn't call me to say, "Jim, what's the case for the reliability of Scripture?" You already know it. The people who call me, they call me because they've got something going on in their life that seems marginally criminal. Like, what's this dude doing over here? I met this guy, this neighbor, this guy's trying to do business with. What do you think? What they want to know is, like, what have you learned? What do I know? What insights do I have about human behavior, about human nature that might help them not make a mistake? This is the book that I probably should have wrote first. And I've been trying to write this book for at least 5 or 6 years, and publishers always say, "Well, maybe next one. So I finally got to the end of all of that, and I got a chance to write it. And I don't know if people were surprised. I mean, this to me, it's a weird hybrid. I've seen it trending on Amazon in like weird areas. It's in Christian apologetics. It's also in Christian self-help, which I think is a interesting name for that category to begin with. But it's also like in I just saw it yesterday in serial killer true accounts. Okay,
Wow, that's interesting.
when does your book cross over those many weird barriers? But for me, it just reflects, I think, what most of the time my friends and family members call me for. And most of the time, it's about the stuff that's in this book, 15 attributes of human nature that if you can master these, you will flourish at the highest level. And if you can guard yourself against the opposites, you can protect yourself from behavioral stupid. So this is really the kind of book. Now, do I think it has some evidential value as a Christian? Yeah. I mean, I think if Christianity is true, its foundational document ought to describe us the way we really are. It ought to describe the world the way it really is. And it turns out that these 15 attributes, although you discover them work in murders, they are well established in the scientific literature, in the sociological literature, and they're all ancient. They're all biblical principles that we've either forgotten, and people will do research and like, oh, look what I discovered, as if this is something
Right,
new.
exactly.
Or we just abandoned them because we don't want to think there's a God who might have some advice for how we ought to live in a culture that thinks that we're all individual gods who decide how we ought to live. So I think that's part of the reason. But I've always wanted to write the book. And finally, Zondervan said, okay, now you can write it. And to be honest, they wanted something else in this spot. And I finally said, hey, look, I just basically tried to convince them that this is the best next option for us. And maybe someday else we can do that other thing we need to do. But let's do this first. And they allowed me to do it first. And so finally I have the book on the shelves that I really wanted to write years ago.
Well, I think it's a great approach. I think it's an interesting way to tackle this because obviously you take these kinds of things both from your historical work that you've done. You use anecdotes from your past experience as detectives, both as a rookie and then later on as you've learned, and then your friends and family as well. But you kind of tie that in with practical application as you say, how to live life. So it's a little bit Jordan Peterson, so to speak, the rules for life, little bit true crime detective novel, and then a little bit of theology and practical application all together. So it's quite the souffle, I would say.
Well, and I knew that, of course, everyone knows Jordan Peterson, and of course I knew he wrote that book. And I was very careful not to read the book or have any idea what his 12 rules are, because I may have some of the same rules. Yeah. I don't know. But I wanted to make sure that I was just coming at them from a list of about, I'd say 40 that I could have written about. So I had a long list. I've been gathering it for years. And I made a master document. I think I first called this book in my own mind, Death Lessons. And that's a terrible name. So we didn't use that name. But I have a master document called Death Lessons, in which I just have been keeping track of things like, hey, someday I should probably write about that. So then I had a chance to go back and look, and I was a chapter book, 10-chapter book. It ended up being 15. So I was able to pull 15 of those. And I think that those are the top 15. I think. But to be honest, the more I talk to other people like you in these kinds of interviews, the more I think, that's a really interesting, nuanced side of this that I really probably should write about someday. So who knows? We'll see what happens with this book. But at least I got the first 15 out.
Yeah, and let me kind of, for our listeners, viewers, let me go through some of these chapters that you offer. The first one is A Pool of Blood Under My Feet, How to Make Age-Appropriate Mistakes. And then you also have kind of a subheading saying that you were created to learn. So each chapter has a topic, how to write better bios, you were created to be known, which, of course, everybody today wants to be known. I think there was a poll once that, 73% of all students said that they were going to be famous. And when you sit back and think about that, well, if 73% 3% of humanity tries to be famous. That's never going to work.
Right.
But there's always, you were created for community. You were created for commitment. You were created to pursue humility. Now, here's interesting aspects of life that we don't talk about, things we miss. And one of the things that I'm intrigued with is not only are you giving suggestions for how people should live, how many of these are you discerning from, say, the other side? In other words, when we look at perpetrators of crime, here are the main things that they're missing in their lives. Right. Did that inform your?
Yeah, that's what triggered all of it. I mean, a lot of it started off with, wow, look at what a train wreck this ended up being. And you can't help but when you're especially if you're investigating case. Now, look, I did a lot of these in just real time. So they happen tonight. We get dispatched out there. We handle it in real time. But a lot of these are where the thing's been sitting cold for years. And so I can actually look at the case and see the larger overarching narrative that goes back 30 years. That's helpful also. But there's times when you're just going, wow, this all could have been avoided. Like if only they would have done that. And sometimes if you're in real time and you're talking, look, I can't help it. Whenever I arrest somebody, not everybody wants to talk, especially these cold case guys. I mean, murderers in general are most of the time not going to cooperate, especially if they haven't been cooperating for 30 years. They become pretty good practiced liars. But you can't help but do it. I can't help but do an interview where I want to ask, how did you get here? That's just who I am, and I have an interest in how did you get from there to here? And because you just can't help but want to help people. Now, some of those conversations I've recorded in this book, and a lot of them don't go very well. I mean, it's not like people listen to my advice, but I've got a chapter, for example, in the book that talks about contentment, how it is that we are constantly chasing stuff. And it's a chapter in which I remember very, very well. I met this kid twice in 2 different arrests. And early on in his life, when I first met him, I had some practical advice for him, which of course he didn't take. And of course, he didn't even remember the conversation in which I had with him years earlier. But I remembered it because it's a chapter that's just about how do you handle money and work? How do you see money? How do you see work? How do you see material possessions? A lot of it is triggered because you meet guys who haven't done this well. And you're thinking, wow, we're so similar. This one kid, for example, was doing robberies. And it's not like he wants anything out of life different than you and I. We want to achieve things. We want to have value and purpose. We want to have a home. We want to live in a place in peace. We want a person who loves us. We want to have a car. But he was so impatient with how he might acquire those things. And, we recognize, well, there's a process you put in place that'll get you to this. Also, we recognize something I tried to share with him was, look, financial independence is not the ability to buy anything. It's the ability to buy anything you want. And I don't want anything. So it turns out I've got financial independence when otherwise I might not. If I had this thing I really thought I needed or wanted, but it's out of reach financially, then I spend my whole life chasing it. Look, either you decide that what you've got will make you happy, or you go out and decide that what makes you happy and go get it. So it's like, go get it or decide that what you got's okay. And it turns out one of these approaches will make you content and satisfied right now. The other leads you to a life of constantly pursuing stuff that even once you get it, you realize it wasn't what you thought it was.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
This is the kind of stuff that we're talking about only because, I arrest. Don't have that approach. And so it highlights it for me. Well, if you had this approach, boy, wouldn't life have been different?
David Brooks who's a New York Times columnist, not necessarily a believer, but he wrote a book called The Second Mountain. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where he looked at many of the stars and successes in both the business world, the entertainment world, sports world. And he said all of them, once they've achieved their peak, once they've kind of captured that gold ring, they all entered almost a period of depression. It's like, okay, yep. I defined myself with the hunt and I don't know what to do next. And he says one of two things happens. Either they fall apart and they kind of drift or become drug-addled or something like that, or they reinvent themselves. And he goes, usually the ones who are successful not only reinvent themselves, they reinvent themselves in the service of others. not in the service of self. Their first mountain was always, how can I achieve these things for me? The second mountain was, how can I achieve these things for others? And of course, if you're doing something like, homelessness or poverty, you'll never conquer that mountain. But it's kind of Jesus' words coming back to us, right? The greatest will be the servant of all. That when you stop thinking about yourself and started serving others, all of a sudden you do get that contentment, because you first of all see how much better you do have it.
Yeah.
And secondly, you're not chasing something. You know that even if you're not getting to the ultimate goal, you're improving people's lives as you go.
Yeah, and it's so interesting, and this is another chapter in this book. There's data on how well as humans we receive. There's a chapter in this book about the balance in our human nature between justice and mercy. Well, there's data on mercy, that we respond to mercy, and not just the mercy shown to us, but we have positive biological outcomes when we simply show mercy to others. So important is serving others that there's data that shows that we actually benefit physiologically just when we watch an act of service toward another. That's how deeply ingrained it is in promote. Now, you mentioned something that's so powerful, and let's just rabbit trail on that for a second. It turns out that there's a chapter in here about trauma, and a lot of that really became highlighted for me as I was working with officers who had been critically injured. And we do this every summer. We spend 6 weeks working with officers who are critically injured, but about getting ready to go in 3 weeks, another 6 weeks this summer. So for 6 weeks, my wife and I are working with people who are married, who are ready to divorce because they have been injured in such a way that now, we used to do this with military, but now it's just officers, police officers. Here's what I discovered about trauma. There is a way to flourish on the backside of trauma. Typically, what happens is you're going along in life. What is trauma? Trauma is simply that you have an expectation of life, a view of the world, and something happens that utterly shatters your view of the world, destroys your expectations. You never thought that would happen to you. It was not in the plan. It wasn't in the way you saw yourself, the way you saw the world. And when it happens to you, it knocks you to your knees. And if you stay down there and you have a depressed level of functioning, you can't move, you can't function at the same level you used to function, well, we call that PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And we see a lot of people who have already been clinically diagnosed from their agency on the backside of a shooting where they're critically injured and now they're not functioning at the same level. They are just beside that. Their marriages are crumbling, they're terrible, and their parenting is starting to suffer. Everything suffers. Well, if you can get them back to the same level of functioning, clinicians call that resiliency. But that's not my goal when they come up to the retreat. My goal is to get them to what we call post-traumatic growth, a flourishing on the backside of trauma at a level that's even higher than you were experiencing on the front side. Now, what the secular world calls this is meaning making. Basically, what the idea here is that if you can make sense of the suffering and see how this suffering moment has actually in some ways opened up opportunities that you didn't have before, that is opportunities and a quality of life that could even be better than was before. If you can make sense of it by kind of asking the question, what is my life story really all about anyway? Is this the final chapter in my story, or is this the climactic chapter from which all things will now blossom? Like in every story, there's that moment where the antagonist and the protagonist come into clash, and then it's resolved in some beautiful way. Okay. But we would say as Christians, it's not about meaning making. I can't just decide, well, the meaning of life is X, because what will happen is something will shift again. And then you'll have to find another meaning. Like you were saying, people who on the backside of trauma kind of reinvent themselves. Well, you can but look, how about if you found the actual true description of who you were always, but didn't maybe even pay attention to? What if you could find the meaning rather than just make up a meaning? If there's a true story of the universe and you simply have to find your chapter in that story, it might help you to see. And you're right, on the backside, typically what I see is that it almost always, it's us leveraging what we just experienced to serve others. So you find these folks will eventually start to chaplain these kinds of programs because they understand now why God would allow them to. I've been getting ready for this trip in the summer, so I'm going through Job again. And, Job is one of those books where you go through it. It seems like it takes forever if you want to do a good job.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm in chapter 21 going, when will this end? But it's
so was
good.
Job, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Maybe that's why there's so many chapters. They want the reader to have some sense of what Job was going through, because this thing takes so dang long to unwrap. Anyway, so I'm going through chapter 20 and I realize, wow, we have a tendency as apologists to respond to the presence of evil. And we see with the theodicy some philosophical view about how we could explain why evil exists alongside a good, loving God who's powerful. Well, it turns out we often see suffering as evil. So we would say that God would not author suffering or even allow it, because God's not the author of evil. But it turns out, and you see it in Job, and you see it also in the officers we're working with, suffering is often the beautiful doorway to something spectacular that you never would have realized if you hadn't had to suffer through that period of your life. It's all about how we find meaning and how we see it falling into the overarching story. So in this one particular case I describe in the book, I see this often in families where they're trying to figure out, like, how do we move on? And some families don't. Some families stay frozen. And by the time I get to the case 30 years later, half the families died of old age, and they never saw resolution, they never saw justice, and they never seemed to recover from the trauma. Others, will actually leverage this and say, what can I do to make the world better given what I've suffered? So I think that part of it is trying to figure out too, how do we, and that's what I try to do in each chapter, is how do I help you to take this principle and use it in your own life so that you can benefit from it? Because people who flourish master this particular topic, and people who don't. So we want to be the people who flourish.
Yeah, exactly. I think it was Dallas Willard who really talked about suffering, and he said, don't disdain suffering, because if you value, how can you value compassion unless there's someone to compassion? He goes, and he says that the things we value most about people are dug from torturous minds. And
yes,
you can't have the gold of generosity without someone in need. You can't have the gold that is produced from kindness and unbridled love without any recompense, without someone in a dire strait. And he says, if those are the things we value, then therefore we have to understand that suffering is a way towards those good ends. It's how we dig through these kinds of ideas.
No, absolutely. I mean, I used to always say it this way: the things that I valued as an atheist were things like courage and compassion and sacrifice. All of these things are not things that just snap on. If I'm a God who's creating a world in which I want the most glorious of characteristics to emerge, I cannot create a world and just snap my finger. You get courage in the face of danger. If you're a loving God who wants courage in the world, you're going to have to allow for some danger, because that's the only way that courage is developed. Compassion, like you said, it's just the opposite kind of world I would have to create in order to get these beautiful attributes that even atheists want. So I think that's why, so a lot of this book is, and if you're working murders, you're often working the worst moment of someone's life, both of the suspect and the victim, of course, but victims' families are also included in that. And you hear these trite words like closure that are just not available in real life. I might get justice, and temporal justice, like justice in our criminal justice system, but I'm not going to get closure. And in the end of all this, your loved one is still going to be dead and brutally taken out before their time. But I think part of it is why I wanted to write a book like this, because so much of what you learn has been helpful, and you don't want to just hold that until I want to write about it because it's the stuff that's helped me.
So you had said, I found it interesting that you really are kind of wired in a way where you like to pull back and you say, how did a person get from here to there? I'm the same way. Think about this thing. There's a kind of a philosophical niche there, but also beyond an individual person, I also look at culture, and I have been scratching my head a little bit and seeing over the past few years what I've done is you know, Jim, that when we do conferences and things like this, it used to be we would be answering Richard Dawkins. It used to be we'd answer the cold case Christianity resurrection thing. That's not what everybody has on their hearts anymore. It's my granddaughter whose best friend is trans. It's my son who's struggling with same-sex whatever the virtue signaling, the modeling. There's all these life issues that our culture has kind of moved.
Yeah.
And I was just, first of all, I was kind of curious in your career when you first started. Have you noticed a shift in folks who say at the beginning of your career the motivations were thus and such, and maybe you're seeing them different now, or near the end of your career? Do you see something that's changed culturally in that? Have we lost something in our society that's making us more adrift?
Well, I do think we are. I've seen, like you, I think the questions have shifted. And I think what was important to me looking at Christianity, what now? I was 35, so I'm now 62, so it's almost 30 years ago. When I was looking at Christianity for the first time, I needed to know, is it true? Because I'm a boomer. And I think that books like Evidence That Demands a Verdict are probably, in cold case Christianity, might be something that you'd be interested in if you wanted to know, is it true? But I think what's happened is that word true has shifted. So when I say, hey, this is true, most of my younger associates, I'm talking about like Gen Z or millennials, people my kids' age, they hear it as it's true for you. Whereas I guess it's true for me. I think the question isn't so much, is it true anymore, that interests seekers. The question is it good? Because it seems to be that if you think it's true, that's one thing, but man, it certainly isn't good. It's the source of all misogyny, racism, homophobia, you name whatever the bad ism is, it's probably rooted in your stupid Christian worldview. Okay, that's the question. Is it good? Is it necessary? Is it still beautiful? Does it matter? I think that's where I started to write Person of Interest for this reason. I wanted to talk about, does it matter? Is it the source of anything good? And all the stuff I would have said as an atheist that I admired, science, education, literature, music, those are things that are all grounded deeply and indebted to a Christian worldview. I just wanted to be able to write about that. I think that's what's changing now. Why is that happening? That's a good question. And I think what's happening is there's an inverse relationship that I see. An increase in depression, suicide, division, polarization, violence, crime, as Christianity is decreasing. And that could be a coincidence. But I suspect what this is the inverse relationship is not just correlated, it's causal. I think if you abandon the teaching of your designer, if we are actually designed, and the designer has a design for the designed, then it'd be wise for the designed to behave in a way that reflects the designer's wishes. So we aren't doing that anymore. This is why I wrote a chapter, which is probably the most controversial chapters in this book, are the chapters on marriage and the chapter on fatherhood. Because it turns out that when you're working murders, if you're on Dateline, like I've been on Dateline, you're probably working a spousal murder. Right? Gaffigan,
right.
The comedian Gaffigan's got a great bit on Dateline where he talks about how, you'd think that everyone who's married eventually is going to murder their spouse because it seems like everyone starts off with the most beautiful marriage and then someone's going to end up dead. So the reality is you're going to probably work something like that. Also, if you've ever arrested people, if you're working in law enforcement, you know already the correlation between fatherlessness and crime. And you can have people try to argue there's no correlation, but you know what? You know better if you're working this. You already know, you're seeing it over and over and over again. The culture is trying to tell us that we can recreate any family structure and get the same results in terms of human flourishing, as if somehow what defines human flourishing is entirely cultural, situational, and in context. No, it's not at all. It's grounded in your biology. Unless your biology is going to change, you are going to flourish under the same conditions you would have 2,000 years ago. Because the relationship between your biological parents and you is no different than it was 2,000 years ago. And yes, I was not raised. It turns out, this is the chapter I'm talking about marriage, that the data supports this. Unless you're going to twist the data for some political reason. Two biological parents who raise their children in a low conflict setting produces the best outcome in children. Sorry, it just does. Now, I wasn't raised that way. I was raised by one biological parent. My dad was absent. He divorced my mom when I was 3. She never remarried. So it's just the two of us. And I didn't raise my family that way. I have 2 biological children and 2 adopted children out of foster care. So those 2 adopted kids are not being raised by their biologicals in a low conflict setting. And I hope, look, can good outcomes come and other variations of this? Of course, of course. But like anything else, when you're looking at statistics, we're looking at generalities. And in general, kids flourish when raised by 2 biological parents in a low conflict setting. Any structure of relationship in which children are present that deviates from the 2 biologicals in a low conflict setting will actually impact the data, will impact the level of flourishing. I wish it wasn't so, for my own sake, because I wasn't raised this way. But it is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why marriage has to be an early trajectory decision for us if you want to flourish at the highest levels.
This is one of the things that I've been focusing on actually in my recent work. I've gotten several people that I've talked with on it. It's something that some of my talks are revolving around because we are at a crisis point in this. Brad Wilcox over at the Institute for Family Studies, the University of Virginia, has done a lot of great work on this. Tim Carney just came out with a book, and we talked with him on the podcast on it.
Awesome.
And just as you say, I mean, you can look at George Burns, who smoked cigars and lived to be 105, but to say because he exists, smoking doesn't cause cancer is just fallacious reasoning, right? It just doesn't make
great. That's a great way to illustrate it. Yeah, so, absolutely. Although I think you and I are the only ones who still remember who George Burns was. But
possibly,
yeah, I get it. Yeah, exactly. Groucho Marx. I mean, another generation before that. So yeah, for sure. But I think a lot of this is just, we might say, and I remember when I didn't start writing, until I was 52. So I had a late start in this field of Christian apologetics, and I never really saw myself as this is where I was going to go, where I was going to be, and here I was. Okay, I was asked to do a committee in Washington D.C., kind of a justice reform committee. And it was filled with people, senators and thinkers, cultural thinkers, other pastors, well-known pastors. And how did I get involved in this? Well, I guess because I'm a cop who wrote a book. And so I'm sitting in this room and we're discussing contributory factors to crime stats. And there's an entire group on one side of the aisle that thinks there's no correlation at all that's worthy to describe between parenting and fathers and crime statistics. And I feel like, wow, what universe are they living in? Yeah, because even anecdotally, I defy anyone who's listening to this who's involved in a law enforcement career who has a different opinion about this. I mean, we all see the same things. Yeah, is it possible to find data that will support a conclusion, like you said? Yeah, there are the George Burns. There are the people out there who defy the data, but this does not mean that the data is not valuable, and it is. And so look. This is a controversial thing to say because so many people in culture right now are either not getting married or they're waiting very, very late to get married. They don't see it as a priority. And that's what this chapter tries to argue for, that of all the trajectory decisions you can make coming out of high school, the first and most, and I ask this at Summit, whenever I'm teaching at Summit, on the porch chat, I always ask the students, like, what's the most important decision you're going to make in the next 5 years? Almost to a person, they'll say it is something related to education and employment, because they're applying to schools right now. They're looking for their. I get it. Well, it turns out the most important trajectory decision you're going to make is worldview. I mean, that's the foundational decision upon which you build every other decision. But the second one, in my view, is spouse. And if you're not intentional, here's why I say it's important, because we're not intentional about our spouses. Most of us think this is a very romantic thing. We're just going to know when we know. It's not. It's a heart thing. And you eventually your heart will bump into one others and you will fall in love. You're not like thinking clearly about what would make a good spouse. How would I find someone like that? How would I recognize that person when I find them? Like, you have these intentionality and you make a list for everything you're going to do to find the right college. You make a list and say, well, here's where my gifts are. This is the kind of job I probably should be involved in. But when it comes to spouse, you just think you're going to dumb into a spouse. You're just going to, eventually show up and someone's going to pop in front of you. We need to be super intentional about spouse, because I have known people who have made very poor career choices, but had a splendid life because they made good spousal choices. And I've conversely known people who made poor spousal choices and had a great career. They were chiefs of police and had 3 marriages, and their lives were basically a train wreck. We have to decide, like, what is important. And it turns out that this one institution is the longest commitment you will make. If there's no God, it is the absolute longest commitment you could make. if there is a God, there's only one personal relationship that'll extend beyond this your marriage, and that's the eternal relationship with your Heavenly Father. So it ought to be something we prioritize, but we don't. And it turns out a lot of the cases I work are examples of when two people did not make marriage a priority. And at 15 years into their marriage, one is killing the other.
Yeah, we are. I think we're such a victim of our media that we, and partially you get a little bit of frustration because there you would hope that there would be some modeling within the family unit itself, but of course, as the family breaks down, then the kids have nothing to look forward to. I tell people, I used to even think of what I call the Bobby Brady understanding of love, right? If you remember the old episode, and it's usually pick your sitcom, but it's always the same. Yeah. The young kid gets kissed by the little girl and he closes his eyes and he sees all the fireworks, and of course that's what love is. And you know what? When it's 2:00 in the morning, you got to go to work the next day and the baby is like projectile vomiting across the room, you're not seeing those fireworks. Those don't exist. But my wife and I both came from broken homes. And we both, before we got married, and it wasn't something that we discussed with one another per se, but we both knew prior to marriage, we said, if we're going to get married, that's it. We just
right.
We decided that marriage is one and done. And it doesn't matter if there's rough edges, then we work through them. But that's simply the way it's going to be. And that has served very, very well.
Well, I can tell you, this is something that for me, and I'm glad we're talking about it, because most of the time when I get interviewed on this book, this is one of those chapters that people don't really think, to ask much about. But I'll tell you that it has been important to me. My wife and I have been together for 45 years. The first 18, we were not Christians. We were 18 years in before we became Christians. The first 9, we were together, but we weren't married. And we were going to school, going to grad school, lived a very secular life. But I did know this. I did know that I was not going to repeat the mistakes of my parents. And this was the biggest mistake, was the family structure. It was terrible. It was not fun growing up in the 60s with a single mom. It just wasn't. And she was very young. She was 18 when she had me. So here she's 21 with a 3-year-old and on her own. Not a good way to, and I remember what that developed in me. Because I had no cover. I never felt safe. I never felt like I felt vulnerable all the time with her, because she was a young girl with a child, and I was growing up with her and didn't have any cover. I'll say this: I've always said that I love marriage way more than I love my wife. Now she benefits from that because I want a certain kind of marriage. And when I do weddings, I always tell the couples, look, you need to love marriage more than you love each other, because there'll be days when you can't even stand each other. There'll be days when you want to choke each other. But you know what? If you love marriage, you'll realize, hey, what is the purpose of marriage for us? Like for me, the purpose of marriage is kind of like a Tim Keller, the Meaning of Marriage book that he wrote. It's that I'm married to somebody who I have given permission to help shape me to become the person I want to be. Because without her and the permission I've given her to tell me the truth, I'm not going to become that person. That's why men flourish when we're married. If I could do one thing differently, here's what I would have done. I would have married her way earlier. 2, I would have started having kids way sooner. 3, I would have had way more kids. A lot of it is because I took on a very secular view of what marriage and children were all about. And if we do that, by the way, if you're likely to walk away from your marriage, because the secular view says, hey, this is about you being fulfilled. This is about you finding your true love. This is about all the things, which, by the way, I feel like I experience all those things. I have that kind of marriage. But it's not because I'm aiming at that. It's because I'm aiming at this other thing, that this all comes along with it. So I think part of that is something you can do it. Obviously, you've had people on who talk about this, and I always felt like, why should anybody care what this detective thinks about this? But it turns out, a lot of the crimes I'm working are crimes where somebody neglected this very important feature of human flourishing.
Well, not only that, but the statistics on divorces amongst police officers is staggering, because it's hard. First of all, it's hard to shut off the authoritative aspect of your position. when you come home, right?
That's right. That's right.
Especially highway patrol officers, I think, are the worst.
Now, seriously, let's talk about that for a second, because that's so true, right? Well, first of all, we all know, we're all the cops in California know, if you get pulled over by a highway patrol officer, everyone's getting the worst possible ticket, okay? Because there's no talking with highway patrol officers. Now, I say that now just to draw the ire of all highway patrol officers, but we notice this too when we're working with BGA, Billy Graham Association, because we'll have, like, the first week is coming up in 3 weeks, and we've got 4 couples who are scheduled to come up for marriage resiliency retreat. 2 canceled. 1's getting a divorce. Couldn't even get them up there before they're getting divorced. We always say, hey, I know, look, it's only 2 weeks away, 3 weeks away. Just come. Let's just see what God can do. But I can't even get them up there sometimes. So here's the thing. You're absolutely right that we often, it's a pride issue that separates us. It's that authority issue. Here's the problem with police officers. It's a communication issue often, because cops are constantly on a high alert. You're driving around in what we call hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is just this idea that I'm looking for danger and I'm looking for what's going to kill me next. And this hypervigilance is what keeps you alive during the shift. And it turns out that hypervigilance causes a certain kind of adrenaline that makes you a very good communicator. So when you're under that high adrenaline, you can talk. You're a talker. You're talking about everything. You're talking about everything you see, everything that's going on in the car. Now, once you're done with your shift, you suffer a crash on the backside, an adrenaline dump on the backside of hypervigilance. So for the next 8 hours or so, you're not going to be a good communicator. Now, when you go home, your spouse typically wants to communicate.
Sure.
I guess, right?
She's been in a drought.
You're on the other side of the adrenaline dump. It takes about 18 to 24 hours for you to recover from that. And guess what? You're back to work in 10.
Yeah.
This hypervigilance cycle that we never seem to be able to get out in front of makes it harder. We have to be very intentional about the way we try to communicate, because typically we're trying to fight with our biology in that hypervigilance cycle. But anyway, that's another issue.
So the other interesting aspect about this, though, marriage and family, is when you have a family, it actually forces you to do the things that we were talking about previously, that you have to be others-centric, right? It's the needs of the child. So I remember I was in a position where I was doing a job, doing a lot of additional analyses and data reconstruction stuff, and kind of the boss was kind of taking the credit for it and not me, and I'm like, I'm the new guy here. Okay. So I let it slide for a while, and it just was really unsatisfying. But I remember 2 things happened. It's like, I've got mouths to feed at home. It doesn't matter if I'm unhappy at my job. Okay. A job isn't to give me personal fulfillment. A job is to put a roof over my head and feed these kids. I have to do it for that reason. And so this other-centric view, especially when you have more kids, right? When you have when you have one kid, you can kind of custom tailor your life to that child. And okay, we'll move dinner to 6:30 because you have practice, Johnny. If you have, 4 kids like I have, then it's like, hey, it doesn't matter. Yeah, all the others are going to be hungry. We got to serve dinner. No, we can't cook just what you like. We've got to cook something that everybody will.
Lenny, I used to always say, you don't have kids until you have 2.
Well,
you're not married until you have kids.
Yeah.
And you don't have kids until you have 2. Now, only because I see the same thing you're seeing. But here's what's great about it. The data shows us that marriage, especially in men, produces certain outcomes which are super helpful for flourishing. And one of them is an increased sense of responsibility. As a matter of fact, the data shows that it doesn't even occur at marriage. It occurs at the engagement. Men start to become more responsible the minute they know they're going to be married. So this is why the data does not just favor marriage. It turns out, crazily, it favors early marriage, the very thing that the culture is rejecting.
Right.
So this is why, and look, I get it. This sounds like an old guy who's just howling at the moon, wishing the old days would return. But it's. I actually include one quote from a sociologist who argues that any data to the contrary seems to be politically or motivated by some presuppositional bias. The raw data does favor what marriage does, not just with you and your spouse, but with your kids. So, and I've collected, by the way, this book, if you look at the book, it's designed. So I always put the briefest possible footnotes. There's still 50 pages of footnotes in this book, but there's like another 200 in the PDF file we offer online. Why? Well, because there's so much data. I'm making a lot of claims here. There's claims are supported by data. I just want you to see what the data is in case you're interested.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. Absolutely. By the way, I tell people, 2 kids, then you have you'll always get it's not me. It's not me. So you right. You always have
you become a good investigator.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. But with 3, it's even tougher because then you got to shift from a man defense to a zone defense. And that's always harder to play. That's
tough. I used to always say you have 2 hands when you have 2 kids. You get the 3rd kid, I'm running out of hands here to hold you. So yeah, it's very, very true. Very true.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And it is important. And it's more than simply longing for the old days. One of the things that people don't realize, one of the crisis points we're getting to is because we are in a real downward spiral of replacing ourselves generation from generation.
Yeah, no kidding.
What that means, and we did a whole show talking on this where you had the 30-year-old women who were balking at the idea of having kids. And this is a big issue. The problem is when those 30-year-olds, yes, they want to travel, they want to be free, they want to live their lives, and maybe they say, quote, maybe I won't be a good mother. I don't know if I'll be a good mother. Well, how do you be a good baseball player? You don't, start off throwing a 90-mile-an-hour fastball. You practice. And how can you practice at being a parent unless you have kids? But that's an aside. The problem is when they hit 65 and some medical issues start to show up, they're not going to be traveling anymore, but they have no children, which means that there are fewer people to provide the services to them that they need. Yeah. Not only their family, but there are just simply fewer doctors in the world. So waiting times get longer. Procedures get more expensive, harder to get into the doctor, harder to have a tax base to support your Social Security. We saw in COVID how tragically so many neighbors said something's going on, and they found out an individual had passed away in their apartment alone, and they were there for 3 weeks. Nobody knew it, right? You've obviously run into these kinds of things. Why did nobody know it? Because there was no second generation around. And this is what you're dooming yourself to. People don't realize how important this generational crash really is going to be, how it's going to affect life.
And they've already seen this. For example, the one-child policy. A lot of Asian countries have already experienced this, that population ages, the workforce ages, and you don't have a replacement workforce coming up below them. Suddenly you're panicking and trying to encourage children, but you're not going to miss an entire generation. Governments cannot encourage children fast enough once they realize the problem they've caused. So I think that, look, in the end, that's just one of 15 chapters, but I think it's important for us to realize that I was fascinated by this, Lenny, that there's a generation right now, even in the church, that feels like any advice at all, any comment about how you should live, or you ought to live, is seen as are you single shaming to argue this? You can't, some people just don't get married. I get it. Or are you victim blaming? If you say that, if she just would have done this, she wouldn't be dead. No, I'm not doing either of those things. But if we're going to say that every piece of advice we give the next generation is in some way to trigger some act of feeling of shame or of blame, then what are Proverbs for? What's the book of Proverbs for? It's just a replete with advice for don't do this, you knucklehead, because you're going to get this bad result. That's what I think wisdom books do. And so what I'm trying to do here is just to provide some ideas of how you might make some small, this kind of, it's like Jordan Peterson's book, I guess, in that sense, that, hey, there's some things you could do to have a better outcome. And we have to be, as a church, we have to embrace this approach, because all of Scripture is really, if you think about it, here's some things you could do to have a better spiritual outcome, right? This is Paul saying to the church, what are you doing? This is the letters. This is Proverbs. This is Scripture. Even Jesus is going to tell people, you ought not live that way. When he says that the last will be first and the first will be last, well, it's certainly a claim about just the nature of reality, but it's also a call on us to stop putting yourself first. So it's both of those things, and that's what I'm trying to do in this book.
Yeah, I agree. And you even start off by trying to tackle wisdom. It's your very first chapter, right? And I've always you kind of wrestle with what does wisdom mean? Is it the same thing as knowledge? You kind of take that
Right.
part back and forth. I've always defined wisdom as knowledge properly applied. Because wisdom isn't the same thing as knowing something. What's the old adage? Knowledge is knowing that tomatoes are fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad. That kind of
That's
thing.
right. That's right. Yeah.
So it's properly applying those things. And
think about it. And one of the reasons why I even approach that subject is because it turns out that there's a certain aspect of wisdom that really requires the theistic worldview. Because even the secular study on this I cite says that moral virtue is a pillar of wisdom. And here's how I always put it. Could you ask this question? What's the wisest way to commit a kidnapping? Well, what do you mean? I mean, if you're saying which way of doing it would guarantee the most success? Or would we say by its very nature, kidnapping is not wise? You can't have a wise way to do a bank robbery or a wise way to do a kidnapping or a wise way to kill your wife. It turns out there's a moral component to wisdom that we often don't even think about. But there is. And so then the question becomes, well, then whose moral code are we employing here? Because I'll tell you, amongst gangsters that I've worked, street gangs, there's a code of conduct, which is all their own, a certain expectation. If you do this, I'm going to do that back to you. And you shouldn't be surprised because I would expect the same treatment if you did that to me. There's an entire code amongst criminals that is not the same code you and I are thinking of. And if groups get to decide the code, well, then wisdom is going to look very different based on the kind of group we're talking about. And there might be a wise way to commit a bank robbery or a wise way to commit a kidnapping or a rape. See, this is the problem. We have to be able to include at least some dimension of wisdom has to include a moral foundation, and it needs to be grounded in the nature of God, or we're going to find a way to pervert that. And this is why I try to draw a diagram that says this is what I'm seeing is in all the literature. I try to provide the literature on this too. But isn't that something that Scripture has always maintained?
right.
And
Exactly.
and the secularists often forget that there's a moral foundation. I was encouraged to see that secular study caught it. And I think as cops, we catch it because we know that the people will even use that language. Like you'll do tape recordings of conversations between bad guys, and they'll often talk about aspects of wisdom when they're talking about immoral acts. You can't have the two. And so this is why it's important for us to at least pass on to our kids. Yes. And also, don't be afraid to fail. Failure is an important aspect. It's got to be age-appropriate failures. And I try to describe one of those of my own in the book, but this is true for all of us. If I make the same mistake 10 years into the job, now I'm an idiot.
Right.
If I make that mistake 10 minutes into the job, I'm just a new guy. And so it's okay. And you should stretch and make those mistakes when you're young and early in a job and not have too much remorse. Don't like, oh, I'm such a failure. No, actually, you're taking the appropriate steps toward wisdom because wisdom usually involves some, and you don't need to fail. If you do fail, you will, but you can learn from other people's failures. That's the beauty of wisdom.
Yeah.
So just watch carefully how other people are messing up and you'll actually be wiser for it.
Yeah, really, that's the same advice that we would give, again, those people who are reluctant to become parents as well. But
that's right.
But beyond that, in the spiritual and the moral realm, one of the things I noticed in the book is the last 5 chapters are really focused on developing your spiritual relationship, that you're a person who needs a relationship with God the Father, that you are built for redemption. And you really wanted to make sure that at least that last third kind of brings everything home. So why don't you kind of talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, that's something that I think you and I, we've done so much work as apologists. And when people usually ask us to come, we're going to make a case for something. And often we'll make that case over the course of an hour. And at the end of it, we'll conclude on the strength of the case as if we're making a case for lasagna. This is why lasagna is good. You should eat lasagna. Off we go. I think the work we've done with officers who are case makers by nature, the minute they get on the street, they're case makers. They're driving down the street. They're thinking, okay, this dude here, Do I have sufficient reason to pull this guy over and making a case in your head? That case, by the way, eventually is going to go on a document that's going to be in front of the DA. So from the very beginning, then you stop the guy and you ask a few questions. Oh, you're building a case for why you should ask to get in this car. Then you build that case. Then you get in the car. You find that you're building the case for why he's arrestable. Then you make that arrest. Then you're building a case from the moment you put your eyes on the guy on the street or in the car or at a call where you've been called out. You're making a case from start to finish. And we're case makers. But you and I both do this. And cops are case makers. And when we get them up there and they're struggling, I often would, when I first started this work, I said, if these guys knew how strong the case was for Christians, because most of them are not Christians, or if they are Christians, they don't even know what Christianity teaches. But if I could just make a case, these case makers would light up the way that I lit up. No, it turns out that the power is not in our case. And it never was. The power is in the gospel. And it in the end, what happens is that I just start off being gospel focused. I might share the gospel in a different number of ways from every angle I can think of. And in the end, those guys who are ready to surrender their life to Christ and get baptized in that icy lake in Alaska where we're doing this, those are the ones who the Spirit of God changes their marriage. It turns out my case never was able to do that. Now, what my case can do is remove some of the barriers so that when I present the gospel, they're open to hearing it. They no longer think of it as a kind of a ridiculous fairy tale. They think of it as, well, this is really an option of how I could reasonably see the world. Tell me more about it. In other words, I'm just using the case to knock down walls. But I've learned that I won't do a conference without I'm going to ask typically, can I preach the gospel at the end? Because in the end of all of this, it's not my case that really changes lives. It's the power of God that's presented through the gospel. Now, I don't think it's a magic sauce, a magic set of words. If I just say the words, I know for me, I heard those words from my people and I was like, blah, 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 blah. I needed somebody to help me see it as reasonable and why I should listen to the words. And so that's how the case, I basically was just tearing down my own walls. But in the end, it's the gospel that changes everything. So that's why this book, and I won't do anything anymore that I don't end up focusing on, is where's the power? The power is not in the case. Where's the power? The power is not in the data. Where is the power? The power is supernatural, and it's when you realize that there is a God, you're not him, that you are a sinner in need of a savior, that there is a savior who actually will satisfy and not just your guilt, and you'll know it. You'll be convicted of guilt, and you'll actually resolve that through accepting the Savior, and that's where the power is for transformation. So it's not, and we've been sold a bill of goods in the church even often, that Jesus is just a good example of how you might have a similar flourishing life. And these principles that Jesus employed, you can employ too, and have the count. Jesus is not an example of how to live. He's the power with which to live. And if we don't share the gospel and point people at that to the end, we've kind of just set them up as an example. All these people in the Bible are examples of a better way to live, instead of allowing the gospel to do what the gospel has always done, which is to change us. And this is why so many people you meet and I meet seem to know so little about the data, about apologetics, yet have been utterly transformed. Because the gospel transforms us. Now, I do think we're in a culture where we need the data. It's not a matter of is it true or good. We got to make the case for both, that it's true and good. That there's a connection between what's true and good. We have to be able to make that case, I think, for the next generation. But I knew that as I end anything now, this has to land firmly on the gospel, or it has no power. So I did want to talk about, eternity, our desire for a heavenly Father, our desire, that shame and the guilt that we wrestle with. What's the difference between those two things? How do we resolve those two things? And what the gospel means in terms of it. That last chapter is called Every Kind of Stupid, because the gospel addresses and cures every kind of stupid you can think of, including your marriage stupid, and your career stupid, and your parenting stupid, and government stupid, and international warfare stupid, whatever stupid thing you're reading about in the news that drives you crazy, the remedy is the gospel. And we have to return to the gospel with people. And I think as apologists, I sometimes would forget that, because that's not what they asked me to do.
Well,
It's sometimes, and some people will say, well, no, you know what, Jim, you just do this case thing, and then I'm the pastor. I'm going to come out at the end and share the gospel. Okay, that works too. But I just never saw that really as my role as an apologist.
right,
I wasn't an
right.
evangelist, but it turns out that's always been my role, and I just didn't see it.
Yeah, because the reason for making a defense is because people are intrigued and they ask, and that's part of it. And of course, one of the things that ultimately follows from this is if you present the true, if you model the good, what normally happens is they see the beauty, they see the third leg of that stool, that God is the good, the true, and the beautiful. Because what can be more beautiful, say, than a family whose relationship is healed and a husband and wife who love each other deeply now where they didn't before, children thriving, understanding that even though you're going through difficulty in the world, you talked about Job, and I know I've talked before about people who hit what I call the Job cascade. The Job cascade is like things go really, really bad, like Job chapter 1, and then you pray to God and it gets worse, right? It's like,
yeah.
And usually I tell people, it's usually at that point that people start to question their faith. They say, well, maybe the atheists are right. Maybe the prayers that I'm saying, are really only hitting the ceiling. And that's the worst time for you to start questioning. You don't investigate these kinds of questions when you're that emotionally wrought. So you need to have the investigative aspect.
That's right.
In order to understand these things. But when those storms come, when you can look back at how he's rescued me in the past, what he's done for me now, those are the things that you will desperately cling to. And I think that those are one of the ways that. And I don't know of any young person. They may argue that morality is relative. They may argue your truth, my truth, but nobody sends to say, I don't want to see the beautiful. That's something I think that we can really also start to leverage a little bit more in our presentation of the gospel, because what you ultimately see is what Jesus does for us is beautiful.
Yeah, and what's interesting too, something that came to mind as you're saying that, is that often as Christian apologists, we have to make a case for why you should be interested in the case. So there's another level to this. Before we can even begin, we're going to make a case for why this should matter to you. But when you're writing books about flourishing, about how it is we could live a life that is more meaningful, there's already a felt need. Not that I get it. I'm not saying that felt need. We've had a lot of discussion about felt need in the church. I get that. But what I mean is there's not as much of a case I have to make. Sadly, if we meet people in their needs, it's so much easier to address their questions, because often if I was just answering questions they weren't asking, I was approaching topics that weren't challenging them.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, the case for is not nearly as good an antidote, or remedy rather, as it is an inoculation. So I always say, look, if you know the reason why this is true before you encounter suffering, you encounter it differently. But if you encounter suffering and you've never looked at the reasons for your faith, and you may not even give me a hearing. So it's important for us to look at those things before we encounter. So let's decide that's why the first worldview issue, the first trajectory issue is going to have to be worldview, because it ends up being the foundation for every other decision you're going to make.
Okay. Yes, that's wonderful. Well, any other ideas? Now, the book seems to be doing well. Just released, correct?
Yeah, it's just out, and I think that, and this is just as a guy who is now, I feel like it's like a private citizen who writes books. That's who I am. I'm not a ministry leader. I don't have a 501c3. I'm just a guy who was a retired detective who saw certain things that I'd like to share with you guys. So my hope is that people will see it as helpful. And it does chart in these different categories that are weird categories. So my hope is that this is something that'll be of value, not just for like, is it true, but how do I land it? How do I live this? What next? What do I do now? That's the kind of book I hope this is going to be.
I'm hoping unbelievers will find it as intriguing, at least, as believers. And I know you address both.
Yeah, no, and we all are trying to do that because that's I'm basically, you know what we do, Lenny, you probably do the same thing. I'm always writing to my old self in addition to my current self. You know, I'm always writing to both because I've been on both sides of that issue and I can kind of see, yeah, but when I was an atheist, I used to think this. So that's always going to come out in my work, either I'm trying to or not, because that's the kind of the foundation from where I'm starting. And look, just to give your listeners a little bit of back behind the curtain insight on this. Anyone can write a book. That's not the trick. The trick is getting someone to read the book. That's always the trick. And it turns out that publishers have changed. They don't ask you what the book's going to be about. They ask you, can you sell it?
Right.
How big is your platform?
Right.
Do
Exactly.
you have this many viewers on? And oh my goodness, it's like there's a chapter in the book on celebrity because I encountered it in my criminal work, and I'll just tell you that it's so repulsive to me. So here I am now doing the very thing that I talk about that I hate, which is I've got to sell a book. Now, here's what I would say. Because I'm so uncomfortable with it, what I try to do is what can I create from a resource perspective that is actually more valuable than the book that I can just give away with the book so that people don't see it as, you know, a purchase of a book, but it's actually something that's more valuable than just the book. So what we try to do, and in this case, our 30-session case makers course, which I built for Gateway Seminary, which is close to where you are, I built that course for Gateway. I'm offering that for free, just for anybody who purchases a book. Why? Well, because I kind of feel like that's what we should be doing, right? Is we should be, you do the same thing. How much free content is on your website? Oh my gosh, I know because I
Yeah.
follow you on social media. So I know how much free stuff's out there. And you are probably the same way. I always tell people you should exhaust what's available for free from somebody before you ever buy a book. So what we want to do is provide a bunch of stuff for free. And then, you know, yes, do I write books? Yeah. And by the way, I'm a retired detective with a pension, and who doesn't want anything? So it gives me the kind of freedom to do write what I want to write about, and you know, let the chips fall where they fall. So this is not my motive. Was never to fleece my audience.
Sure.
Yeah, the motive has always been what do I do in this stage of life where I want as a daily discipline to create content that'll advance the gospel and advance the Christian worldview. I think we're kind of in that situation, and I think that's relatively. I mean, I hope that's rare, and I hope that we're making that obvious by trying to provide enough free resources. So we offer all of that. Just to say that we offer all that at the truthandtruecrime.com, and all you can see what the download package involves and what it includes. And my hope is that that's of value to you. But here's what I would say: if you're going to download that 10.5-hour course, take it. I see people. I can tell who's downloading and who's not, and what they're
Yeah.
doing. And my goal is not to. I want you to actually learn the case in its complexity, in its depth, as deep as you can, so that you can then handle trauma. Because, like you said, once you're in the middle of suffering, it's you're not going to spend the 10.5 hours to learn why the Christian
No,
worldview is
you
true.
won't. No, not at all.
Yeah.
You
So
your
do
mind
it
will be in a
now.
different
That's right.
place.
So
Yeah.
so if you're going to offer something, my hope is that you'll actually, you know, watch it, read it, learn from it, and advance it. You know, so.
So we'll go ahead. We'll put a link to the book so that people can get it. We'll put a link to the website as well, so
Okay.
that individuals who are interested in downloading the materials or taking the
Awesome.
course can do all that as well. So what's next?
Yeah, I have to. Well, I don't have to. I get to. This is, you know, your language gives you away, right? The next thing for me is I'm with Zondervan still. I have 2 more books I'm writing with Zondervan, but they're kids' books.
Oh,
So I'll
okay.
be writing a book called Think Like a Detective, which is just kind of like the old Hardy Boys detective manual, like how to investigate things. And of course, that's going to come from a Christian angle. But I haven't written a book like that yet, just general detective principles. And the next book after that will probably be a person of interest for kids because we're trying to make that accessible to that 8 to 12 range. So that will bring our kids' books up to 5. Right now, we've written 3. And we have those at the casemakersacademy.com, and that's where homeschoolers are using those. But I really think that's the audience that is the future. It's people, and sadly, kids are making a decision about Christianity at around 12 now, where it used to be around 17.
Yeah.
It's because we are unfortunately giving our kids the glowing rectangle by the time they're in junior high. And so we've introduced the world to them in a way that doesn't help us communicate the Christian worldview. So we better reach kids in that 8 to 12 range if we hope to give them a firm foundation before we send them off to the glowing rectangle. So that's the goal in the next year. So I'll be working on kids' books starting in the fall.
Well, that's exciting. I'm glad to hear it. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jim. Always appreciate you. Like I said, I'll be reaching out. We're hoping to do more Dare to Defend conferences, have you out to those again.
I love doing those. I'm looking forward to the next one. Everyone, if you don't know about the Dare to Defend conferences locally here in Southern California, get on Lenny's website. You need to join us there. Those have been I think that they are under attended, and they are well attended. But they are a well-kept secret right now in Southern California. So if you are in Southern California, you've got a great opportunity because Lenny always gets a great lineup. So be there next year for sure.
Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, have a good rest of your day. Thanks so much, and God bless on you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.